The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Luke. There was a rich man who was dressed in purple and fine linen and lived in luxury every day. At his gate was laid a beggar named Lazarus, covered with sores and longing to eat what fell from the rich man's table. Even the dogs came and licked his sores. The time came when the beggar died, and the angels carried him to Abraham's side. The rich man also died and was buried. In Hades, where he was in torment, he looked up and saw Abraham far away with Lazarus by his side. So he called to him, "Father, Abraham, have pity on me, and send Lazarus to dip the tip of his finger in water and cool my tongue, because I'm in agony in this fire." But Abraham replied, "Son, remember that in your lifetime you received good things, while Lazarus received bad things. But now he is comforted here, and you are in agony. And besides all this, between us and you, a great chasm has been set in place, so that those who want to go from here to you cannot, nor can anyone cross over from there to us." He answered, "Then I beg you, send Lazarus to my family, for I have 5 brothers. Let him warn them, so that they will not also come to this place of torment." Abraham replied, "They have Moses and the prophets. Let them listen to them." "No, Father Abraham," he said, "but if somebody from the dead goes to them, then they will repent." He said to him, "If they do not listen to Moses and the prophets, they will not be convinced, even if somebody rises from the dead." Words inspired by God. Stories come in all shapes and sizes, all the ways from great epics like the Mahabharata of India or the Fíneacht of Ireland, all the ways down to pithy little proverbs. My grandfather, Daddy Jim, was an expert on the epics. He filled me with all of the great Irish folklore epics. Some of the stories would take 2 or 3 nights in the telling. All the way down to the pithy parables, the pithy proverbs. And Ireland was very famous for those, particularly the parts of Ireland where Gaelic was still the mother tongue, what we call the Gaeltacht. And I spent 3 months between my junior and senior year in high school in a Gaeltacht in Ireland called ÓLaoire, collecting proverbs. In Irish we call them Seán, and Seán literally means ancient words. And I collected 432 of them that I put in a little booklet. But I remember one old man telling me at one stage, he said, if Christianity had never come to Ireland, we could live according to the Proverbs. He was absolutely right. The wisdom of the Proverbs is extraordinary. So all the way between, the lengthy epics and the little pithy one-liner Proverbs lies parables. And the greatest expert in parable teaching, in my experience, was Jesus the Christ. So when you look at stories of all kinds, all the ways from epics to parables to proverbs, what you find is that stories are the archived wisdom of a culture. That's where they store their treasures, the wisdom treasures. But every storyteller adds a kind of a gloss. Even if you hear an epic being told, different shanachis, different storytellers will tell it a little bit differently. And so one of the things you learn when you listen to a story being told is that you're dipping into both the wisdom of the culture which gave birth to it, and also you're getting an insight into the psyche of the person who's telling you the story. And that's what I want to focus on this morning for the homily, because I think Jesus was the greatest parable teacher of all time. And when you listen to his parables, you learn something about the wisdom of the culture that gave birth to him. But you learn a lot more as well about the psyche of the teacher himself, about Jesus' own personality and his psyche. So I'm going to just make 3 main points this morning. The first one I'll call the Holy Trinity. And then secondly, I want to talk about personality theory. And then thirdly, I'll call it Jesus, the transpersonal psychotherapist. So there are the 3 points I'll make this morning. So the first one, the Holy Trinity. It seems like a strange place to start. The first great playwrights definitely were the Greeks. They created this extraordinary literature of plays. And when they acted them out, when an actor came on stage in a Greek drama, he would wear a mask in order to alert the audience as to what kind of a character he was going to portray. And so, different kinds of masks told you different things. If he came out with a mask that looked like this, it was going to be a comedy. If he came out with a mask that looked like that, it was going to be a tragedy. So different masks clued the audience in as to what kind of a character he was going to portray. And the name in Greek for that mask was called prosopon. Now, when they translated that, the Romans took it and they translated it into Latin. They called it persona. So a persona, it's obvious, per means through, and sona means to sound. So persona, or mask, or prosopon, was that which you wore through which you made sounds. You saw through it, peepholes, and you spoke through it as well. So prosopon or persona literally meant the mask the actor wore in order to clue you into what kind of a character he was going to portray. Now, when the Greek fathers in the 4th and 5th century were trying to understand who God was and where Jesus Christ fit into the scheme of the divine, they used this very same thing. They used the word prosopon. And so they claimed that God just had one nature, a divine nature. But there were 3 prosopon in that one nature, or 3 personas, or 3 personalities. So when we get into English and psychology, the word person and personality and persona all come from the word mask that you wore. So what they were saying wasn't so much that God exists in 3 different kinds of entities as one divine nature, but rather that we experience God in 3 kinds of ways. So when they talk about the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, what they're really saying is it's not a description, kind of an ontological description of who God is in herself, as much as it is saying, here's how we experience God. We experience God as a creator, and they call that the Father. We experience God as a redeemer, and we call that Jesus Christ. And we experience God as a sanctifier, one who makes stuff holy. And we experience that as the Holy Spirit. So it wasn't really a description of God. We can't say anything about God. God is an ineffable truth. It cannot be articulated. But we can say how we experience interactions with God. And so those 3 ways, as creator, as redeemer, and sanctifier. And I believe that as human beings, we have the same thing. We're all wearing masks. And we have the same kinds of 3 experiences. In the mask of incarnation, in this spacesuit that we wear, we have the same kinds of experiences. We experience a relationship with God. You experience a relationship with yourself, and you experience a relationship with others. And by others, I include nature. So basically, you're a trinity. You're wearing a trinity of masks, of personas. The relationship with God, the relationship with yourself, and then the relationship with everybody else, including nature itself. So I'm putting that as the basis because that's the basis then of personality. That's my first point then, that the Trinity itself is a psychological endeavor to understand the experiences that we have. My second point then, I'm going to talk about personality theory. And there's been a long debate in psychology about whether personality is primarily the result of nature or of nurture, whether it's primarily genetics or environment. And there's lots and lots of debate about this. Now, anybody who's ever, raised a child or a family or even kittens realizes that it's ridiculous. So behavioral psychology thinks that, you're born tabula rasa, you're an empty slate, and the environment can write anything it wants onto it. It can reinforce particular kinds of behavior and punish other kinds of behavior and thus create the personality of its choice. If you have more than one kid, you realize this is ridiculous. Kids come out of the womb totally different already. I adopted 2 little kittens about 3 or 4 months ago, and from the word go, they're radically different little kittens from the same litter. And so the idea so that, we come in empty slates and we can write whatever we want, that's ludicrous. So the environment does not create a personality on its own. And same genetics doesn't account for everything as well. Certainly the environment is going to continue to transform and fashion what comes through. So they build then personality theory on that kind of debate. And there are different kind of cookie cutters that are used to try to understand personality. And so I've used this example before. I used to watch my grandmother baking cakes. She was a very, very good baker. And she'd roll out the dough. She had a rolling pin that she rolled out the dough with. And then she'd use different kinds of cookie cutters. Sometimes she'd use a triangular one. Sometimes it was square. Sometimes a round one. Sometimes one shaped like a star. So it didn't really matter what cookie cutter you used. The dough was the same. So the individual behind was the same. Now, psychology does the same thing. It creates all these models. So there's a very simple model that says, basically, people come either as introverted or extroverted. So that's a very simple little model. Another model that they use is called the 16PF, that there are 16 personality factors that determine the makeup of the personality. There's one called the Myers-Briggs, which is another way of trying to understand different groups of people. Or there's one called the Enneagram, 9 different personality types. So basically, they're all just trying to understand the individual person by putting the cookie cutters of these different templates down. But obviously, that doesn't do duty really to who you are. So I have a different model. I believe that the personality is an artifact of 3 pieces. There is nature, obviously. Genetics play a role in it. Nature plays a role in it. And definitely environment plays a role in it as well. But much more importantly is the soul that comes in with its previous trajectories of lifetimes. And so by far the most important ingredient in determining the emergent personality will be the soul that came in with its previous histories. And I've seen lots of evidence in my psychology practice that you can take an old soul and put it into a crippled body in a dysfunctional family, and it will shine anyway. You can take a young soul, put it into a perfectly healthy body in a loving family, and it'll screw up anyway. So it is much, much more complicated. It's made up of many, many, many different factors. So I would say that personality, in some senses, is the mask that the soul wears in order to clue everybody else in as to what kind of a role you're going to play in this incarnation. And the very word personality tells you that. Personality from persona, from prosopon, means you're wearing a mask. Now, it's not that you're trying to fool people. It's that you need an interface between the soul and the environment into which you're coming. And so in some senses then, there's this great dance that goes on. That the personality that you emerge with is the way you're indicating to your family, to your friends, and to society, this is the role I've come to play in this lifetime. And so there's the clue to everybody else. Here's what I've come to do. So you're in a Greek drama that you fashioned yourself. It's part of your preconception contract that when you came in, you chose particular parents, you chose particular family, you chose particular period in human history, you chose a particular culture, and you wore a specific kind of mask, your spacesuit, if you want it. You're wearing a mask that should tell you and tell everybody else, this is what I came to do in this lifetime. So this is your mission for this lifetime. That'll be my second point. So I had 3 main points. This is the third one. I'm going to divide it into 3 subsections. So 3 is the number for today. Okay. So firstly, I'm going to talk of Jesus. The topic itself now is going to be Jesus, the transpersonal psychotherapist. But I want to talk about his notion of the kingdom of heaven. What does that actually mean? And then I'm going to talk about the dialectic or the dialogue between the ego and the soul that comes in. And then I'm going to talk about a few parables of Jesus that illustrate his teaching about the psyche. So firstly, the notion of the kingdom of heaven. When Jesus uses this phrase, the kingdom of heaven, for most of us, we think that the kingdom of heaven is a place we go to in the afterlife. You have to die first. There's a great story of a young Irish kid in a school in Dublin, and I'm going to have to change the language a little bit. And the teacher is teaching them. The kids are like 6 or 7, and she says, "What do we have to do in order to get to heaven?" And we says, "We have to be really good." Okay. Anybody else? We have to love our parents. Anybody else? Little Jenny. Yeah. What do we have to do before we go to heaven, Jenny? We have to go bloody well die. You have to bloody well die before you get to heaven. No, he used a different word. I've censored it a little bit. So a lot of us think that we have to die in order to get to heaven. And that's not true at all. Jesus is telling us the kingdom is en mesoi, is the term he uses, which means within you and among you. So the kingdom of heaven is not a place we go to after we shuffle off this mortal coil. The kingdom of heaven is a state of consciousness. It's an enlightened state of consciousness. It's an awake state of consciousness. It's an aware state of consciousness. You don't have to die in order to access the kingdom of heaven. It's all around. It's only a question of waking up to who you really are. It's a shift in your state of consciousness. I've said to you before that when I was teaching this in Kenya, I would use a phrase in Swahili that was alliterative. I would say, Mbinguni si mahali bali ni hali. You can hear the alliteration there. Mbinguni si mahali bali ni hali, which translates as, the kingdom of heaven is not a place, it's a state of mind. And that's what it is. It's an awake state of mind. So when Jesus then is talking about the kingdom of heaven, he'll say these really outrageous things like, I and the Father are one. To see me, Philip, is to see the Father. So was this a unique claim that only Jesus could make, that only it was true only of Jesus that he and the Father were one, or that to see Jesus was to ipso facto see the Father? Or was Jesus giving us something which was a mystical realization that anybody who wakes up can say the very same thing? I and the Father are one. To see me is to see the Father. Because ultimately, you're a mask that the Father is wearing in order to experience incarnation. Now, there's a big difference between the ego saying that and the soul saying that, and I'll get to that in a few minutes. So Jesus very definitely was of the realization that he and the Father were one. That if you really, really saw him, you saw the Father. Now, he got in big trouble for saying this. At one stage, there's a story in John's Gospel where the crowd took up stones and they wanted to kill him. And he said, hold it a second. I've done many wondrous things for you. I've raised the dead. I've healed cripples. I gave sight to the blind. For which of these are you going to kill me? They said, no. We're not going to kill you because of the good things we did. We're going to kill you because, although you're a mere mortal, you're claiming that you're God. We're going to kill you for that. Now, they obviously didn't understand the claim that he was making. About 1,000 years later, there was an actual event where a great Sufi teacher, an Islamic mystic, had the same realization as Jesus, and he ran into the marketplace saying, I am God, I am God, I am God. And they took up stones and they killed him because they didn't understand what he was saying. Meister Eckhart, a few hundred years later, almost got killed for the same kinds of stuff. In one very famous Christmas homily, he said, what benefit to me is it that my Savior was born of a virgin, 1,400 years ago? If he's not born again in my time and in my heart, every single one of us is meant to be the mother of God. So not only was Meister Eckhart saying, I am God, he was saying, I gave birth to God, because he knew exactly what he was saying. He had the wisdom to die on the way to Rome, where he was going to be interrogated and probably killed. So he got that. So I would say very definitely that we're all bite-sized pieces of God. We're souls on safari. We're spirits in spacesuits. Every one of us has proceeded from God. And so when we think about the kingdom of heaven, when Jesus teaches about the kingdom of heaven, he's definitely not pointing to an afterlife where people who keep rules get, to play harps. He's not talking about that. He's talking about an awakened, aware consciousness so that you recognize the divinity in yourself and ipso facto, the divinity in everybody else. Now, there's a very big difference between a mystic making that claim and a psychotic making that claim. So the second half of the third point is this. I will look at the dialectic then between, the ego and the soul. When we agree to incarnate, there's a docking has to take place between two different intelligences. There's the intelligence of the spacesuit or the organism. Every organism has a native intelligence. Flowers know how to turn to the sun. Animals know how to provide food for themselves. So there's a native intelligence. Now, that intelligence has only two agendas. It is survival and reproduction. That's the agenda of the spacesuit. The soul comes in and has got a totally different agenda. Its agenda is unconditional love. The realization that there is only God, and unconditional love is our relationship to God. So now you get these two docking, and sometimes it's a battle. It's meant to be a dance between the two. You've signed up for this, but very often it's more of a battle than it is a dance. So how do you have these two pieces dock successfully with each other? Now, Jesus will point this out very, very beautifully with two very important sayings. He'll say stuff like, you must take up your cross daily and follow me. Now, what does he mean? He means you must go around life with the lugubrious long face in you because of the vicissitudes. He's not saying that. He's saying you have to align yourself with your incarnational mission. The cross is not about, bereavement of any kind or torture of any kind or vicissitude even. It is the realization you volunteer to put on this spacesuit. You're taking up this cross of your spacesuit. But the importance of this is, when you look at a cross, the elements of a cross, there's the vertical arm of the cross. And what does that mean? That means there's a connection between the ego down here and the soul up there. The vertical arm is the connection between the ego and the soul. And it is the ego that grounds the soul. And it's very important. A soul could not have an incarnational experience if there weren't an ego. The ego is not a bad thing. It is the grounding mechanism that allows the soul to experience incarnation. But it can be problematic, if it's not properly grounded. So where I live, years and years and years ago, I made a little fence of redwood, little redwood trees. So narrow little things that I stuck in the ground as uprights, and then I ran a railing around them and attached them. So there's this little railing that runs around part of the property, and it's just the uprights and then the cross members. And after a few years, I noticed that some of the uprights were rotting in the ground. Ants were eating them. And so the fence began to tilt over. Now, that's what happens with the vertical arm of the cross. The ego is embedded in the groundedness. But if the ego thinks that that's all it is, it rots away, and finally the whole pillar collapses. The horizontal arm of the cross is what Native American Indians would call all my relationships. And I don't mean my cousins and my uncles and my aunts. I mean all sentient beings, everything that is alive. That's the horizontal arm of the cross. And where the two of them intersect, from the ego to the soul and all my relationships, that intersection point is this incarnation, this lifetime that you've dedicated yourself to. And so when you have that realization, then you can say the same thing that Jesus did. But it's coming from your soul. When you say, I am God, it's your soul proclaiming that. It's not your ego saying that. So the psychotic drowns in the very same waters in which the mystic swims. So the psychotic will make a claim, particularly if he's suffering from paranoia of the grandiose type, thinking he's God. It's coming from the ego. I'm God, but none of you are God. It's just me. I'm the only person who's God. That's very different from the mystic making the same statement. I am God, because he realizes that the spacesuit is merely a mask that God is wearing in order to generate experiences. Or to use another kind of an example, it's like the difference between you call an Uber and you want to go to a restaurant in Mountain View, and you give the Uber the address. But the Uber driver starts taking you someplace else. You say, no, I want to go to Chili's in Mountain View. And the guy is taking you to the airport in San Francisco. And so it's like the Uber driver is taking you where you don't want to go. So it's like the ego has taken control of the Uber instead of the passenger who's paying the fare. So the passenger is the soul, but it needs an Uber driver to get it to its destination in incarnation. But somehow the Uber driver thinks that he's in charge and he can choose the destination himself. That's what happens in this kind of dichotomy if the ego and the soul are not working properly together. Now, the third part then is I'm going to talk about some of the parables of Jesus that seem to me to illustrate this teaching. And there are going to be three parts to this third part of a third part. Three different parables that illustrate this. Okay? So the beauty of the parables is that they're so evergreen that different people listening to the same parable are going to unpack it very, very differently. Depending on where you're at in your spirituality, you're going to unpack it very differently. And as you go back to the parables of Jesus at various stages of your life, you'll unpack them differently on subsequent stages. If you're growing, you'll see deeper and deeper levels to them. So very, very often, the parables of Jesus are unpacked at a kind of a literal level. And if that's where the audience is at, that's fine. But you go back to them later, and you see various depths to it. So I chose this very strange reading today, and it seems really lugubrious, the story of the rich man and Lazarus, where the rich man dies and goes to hell and is asking God, please just give me a drop of water, and he refuses to give it to him. That seems like a real cruel parable until you start digging into it in a much, much deeper level. So for some audiences, this was a parable where Jesus is differentiating between the Jews and the Gentiles, that the Jews have rejected him, and so he's choosing somebody else now, the poor person covered with sores, the Gentiles, in particular Christians. Or some people would claim this is a parable that distinguishes between the sinners and the law keepers. I think there's a totally different meaning here. I think this is a parable about the ego and the soul. And here's how I would unpack it. That the rich man in this story is a representative of the ego, which is, blindsided by incarnation. And so he came into a lifetime with lots of resources, lots of benefits. So the lesson the soul signed up for was to learn gratitude and compassion for those who had less resources. But he didn't learn either of the lessons. He wasn't grateful for what he had, and he wasn't compassionate to those who didn't have. So he used up the entire incarnation without ever fulfilling his mission. The poor man, Lazarus, who was lying outside the gate, he signed up for a mission in a very different body with different kinds of resources and a different mission. His mission was to try to learn patience, perhaps, and resilience, and maybe forgiveness for those who were refusing to help him from their resources. And it seems like he learned the lessons really well. He learned patience, he learned forgiveness, and he learned resilience. So it came to the end of that incarnation, and he was at a place where he could appreciate heaven. Who was Abraham in this story? Abraham comes across to the character and says, no, you had good things when you were alive. He suffered now, tough luck, drink it up. So you're down there for all eternity. It has nothing got to do with that. It's not a judgment into hell. Abraham, for me, represents the fact that at the end of every incarnation, the soul determines whether or not it has learned the lesson it signed up to learn. Did I perform my mission? Did I really accomplish that which I came down to do? And the soul realizes you can't skip stages. You can't just jump from being greedy and self-concerned and ungrateful to being, a deeply spiritual person. You have to go through the lessons. So you can't go from there to here, and we can't go from here to there. It's not a divide between heaven and hell. It's the realization at the end of a lifetime, did I do what I set out to do, or did I not do it? And if I didn't do it, I'm going to have to learn that lesson again. And that's not a punishment. It's the soul's desire to grow in love that brings it back again and again and again. So that's how I would unpack that first parable today. The second parable, dealing with the same issue for me, would be the prodigal son. And you all know the story of the prodigal son, that this father had two kids, and one of them was a rake that wanted to get his inheritance, and he went off and he blew it. And then he realized he was poor, he was sick, he was hungry, and he came home and he asked for forgiveness. The older son, who's responsible and does what his father tells him, is really upset that his father has killed the fatted calf. Now, a lot of people, again, would unpack this parable and say, that represents the fact that there's the older son represents the law-abiding people, and the younger son represents repentant sinners, and God forgives the repentant sinner. It has nothing got to do with that. Again, it's a soul and an ego configuration. And so the Father for me represents the soul. The soul has come in with a mission to love unconditionally and is capable of unconditional love for anybody, for both sons, the guy who blew his inheritance and the guy who was responsible. The two sons represent for me a kind of a split ego, a split between in Freudian language, between the id and the superego. And so the id is the part of us that wants, the goodies and we want it now. We're not prepared to wait. And so that's the part of the ego that wants immediate gratification. That's the younger son in this instance. The older son is the superego, always watching, what's daddy going to say? What's society going to think? I got to keep the rules. Get your head down, work hard. But he's a joyless kind of a character and an unforgiving kind of a character. So they're the two parts, the superego battling the id. The father can accept both of them, and he's trying to bring them together to accept each other so that you've got a balanced way of dealing with the mission. So again, for me, it would be a parable of the ego and the soul. And the third one I would mention is called the tenant farmers. And briefly, the parable is this. Jesus says, there once was a landowner, who fenced off a piece of his property, and he planted vines, and he dug a wine press, and he built a wall around it, and he started growing his grapes. And then he went off for a few years on safari, and he rented the land to tenant farmers. And the agreement was, when it comes to harvest, I'm going to send back people, and they'll take my share of the harvest, and you get your own share of the harvest. So he goes off for a few years, and now it's harvest time. The grapes are ripe, and he sends back a group of servants to get his section of the harvest. And they refuse to give it to him. The tenant farmer says, no, we haven't seen this guy for years. We're doing the work here, bugger off, more or less. So send him packing. They come back, they say, they won't give us your share of the harvest. So he said, really? So he sends a second group and do the same treatment to the second group. Throw them out of the vineyard. He sends a third group and do the same with the third. So finally the farmer thinks, well, they're not listening to my servants. I'll send my own son. He's my heir. They'll certainly listen to him. So he sends the heir to collect his share of the harvest. And the tenant farmers say, wow, this is the son, the heir. If he's dead, there's nobody to inherit his land. We'll get the land. So they kill the son. Now, what is this? Is this a parable again about, that the Jews rejected Jesus, and so now he's going to choose, the Gentiles or Christians or whatever? It has nothing got to do with that. It's not about saints and sinners whatsoever. It's again about the ego and the soul in a sense. In fact, for me, it's Jesus teaching reincarnation. The first group he sends back represents one lifetime, and they want to have the harvest. The soul is trying to reap the harvest of that incarnation, and the ego won't have it. We're not giving up anything. This all belongs to us. So he sends a second incarnation. Let's try it again. We went back, to heaven in the meantime. We figured out, I blew it. I forgot why I went down. I go down this time, and I won't forget. I promise I really tried to deliver. And you go down a second time, and the very same thing happened. The ego takes over, and the soul is denied the harvest of the incarnation. A third lifetime, a third incarnation comes, and it's the same process. And finally, a fourth incarnation comes, and not only will the ego give up the fruits of its labor, it won't even believe in God anymore at this stage. It's so engrossed with itself that it doesn't even believe in God. The first 3 times it believed in God, but it was selfish, so it didn't pay any attention. It gave no harvest to God. Now they figure out there isn't even a God. So the harvest definitely is ours. So they kill the son. They try to get rid of the soul completely. So for me, again, it's the story of the dialectic between the ego and the soul in the process of incarnation. So ultimately, I'd say this, that the 3 greatest psychologists I've ever read, I would say, without a doubt, would be William Shakespeare, Gautama Siddhartha, the Buddha, and Jesus the Christ. And it's very interesting that you see the genius of Shakespeare sociologically. He was a brilliant social psychologist. You look at the characters he creates and the dynamics in his plays, and you see this guy really is a brilliant social psychologist. You look at the Buddha, and I don't know anybody who understood the human mind better than the Buddha. So he was a brilliant cognitive psychologist. And then you have Jesus, and nobody understood the spirit and the connection between spirit and matter like Jesus did. So I would say he was an absolute brilliant mystical psychologist. So to kind of paraphrase Paul said one time, so I would say that maybe Shakespeare was the greatest social psychologist of all time, the Buddha was the greatest cognitive psychologist of all time, and Jesus was the greatest mystical psychologist of all time. And to paraphrase Paul said one time, there are 3 things that last: faith, hope, and charity, and the greatest of these is charity or love. I would say there are 3 kinds of psychology. There's social psychology, there's cognitive psychology, and there's mystical psychology, and the greatest of these is mystical psychology.